Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're looking into acetylation.
Acetylation.
It's one of those things that sounds a little bit boring at first, but when you start looking into it, you realize
Oh, yeah.
how fundamental it is, and it's actually really, really fascinating.
It is.
We've got this great article from S.A. called Illuminating the Multifaceted Role of Acetylation.
Uh-huh.
And I have to say, just skimming through this thing, I was pretty impressed.
Yeah, it's a great overview.
Yeah, and we should say, that acetylation is a chemical tweak that happens inside of cells.
Right.
And it affects everything from gene expression to how our bodies use energy.
It's really remarkable how such a subtle modification can have such widespread consequences. And it really all comes down to this,
Yeah.
addition of an acetyl group to a molecule.
Okay.
It's a simple change,
Yeah.
but it has a huge impact on how that molecule functions.
Can you break down
Yeah.
what an acetyl group is for
Yeah.
people who,
Yeah, so
didn't take organic chemistry?
think of it like this.
Okay.
You've got a protein or even DNA, and you attach a little sticky note to it.
Uh-huh.
That's basically what an acetyl group is. It's just a small chemical structure, and when it gets attached to a molecule, it changes the molecule's properties.
Okay.
And that change can then trigger a whole cascade of events.
So it's like a domino effect.
Exactly. One tiny tweak can set off a chain reaction.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And the thing is that this process, acetylation, it plays a central role in at least three really key areas. We've got gene regulation,
Okay.
we've got protein function, and we've got metabolic regulation.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking like really fundamental processes here.
Or absolutely. These are processes that are essential for life.
So maybe let's start with genes, because I think most people have at least a basic understanding of genes.
Sure.
How does acetylation affect our genes?
So your genes are encoded in your DNA, right?
Right.
And your DNA is tightly packed into chromosomes. Now, to regulate which genes are active or inactive, the cell uses this clever system of packaging and unpacking the DNA.
Because not every gene can be active at the same time.
Exactly. There needs to be some control.
Right.
And that's where acetylation comes in.
Okay.
So DNA is wrapped around these proteins called histones,
Uh-huh.
and the addition of acetyl groups to these histones can actually loosen the DNA,
Oh, wow.
making it accessible to the cellular machinery that reads and transcribes genes.
So it's kind of like opening up a book to a specific chapter.
That's a great analogy.
Acetylation allows certain genes to be read.
That's right. And conversely, removing those acetyl groups from the histones can tighten the DNA packaging, essentially closing the book and silencing those genes.
That's so cool. I mean, it makes you wonder what happens if the wrong genes are unlocked or silenced.
That is a crucial question because that's where we start to see the links to diseases like cancer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
For example, there's a specific gene called P53.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, sometimes it's referred to as the guardian of the genome.
Doesn't it help prevent tumors?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It helps regulate the cell cycle and prevents uncontrolled cell growth.
Okay.
But research has shown that if P53 is improperly acetylated, it can lose its ability to function correctly.
So it's like disabling the security system
Yeah, you could say that.
and leaving the cell vulnerable to cancer.
Exactly. And this is just one example. There are many other genes involved in cell growth and proliferation that are tightly regulated by acetylation.
So it's not just this one gene, it's a whole system.
It's a whole network of genes and proteins.
Wow. Okay, so we've established that acetylation is key for gene regulation.
Yeah,
And that disruptions to this process can have serious consequences.
right.
But what about protein function?
So proteins.
How does acetylation affect how proteins work in the cell?
Proteins are like the workhorses of the cell, right? They carry out all sorts of functions.
Yeah.
And just like with histones, the addition or removal of acetyl groups can dramatically alter a protein's shape and activity.
So you're saying that a protein's function can actually change just by adding or removing this tiny acetyl group?
Precisely.
Wow.
For instance, acetylation can influence a protein's ability to bind to other molecules, its stability, even its location within the cell.
So a single acetylation event can have this huge ripple effect.
Yes.
It's not just the protein itself, but also the entire network of interactions that it's involved in.
Exactly. It's like changing the configuration of gears in a complex machine. Even a small adjustment can change the entire output.
Okay, so we've talked about gene regulation and we've talked about protein function.
Right.
both of which are clearly influenced by acetylation.
Yes.
What about that third area you mentioned?
Metabolic regulation.
Metabolic regulation. How does that fit in?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that acetylation plays a vital role in metabolism as well.
Really?
Remember how we talked about acetyl groups being added to molecules?
Yeah, the little sticky notes.
Yeah, those little sticky notes.
Yeah.
Well, those acetyl groups, they are derived from a molecule called acetyl-CoA.
Okay.
And acetyl-CoA is a central player in cellular metabolism. In fact, acetyl-CoA is a key intermediate in the breakdown of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and it's also essential for the production of energy within the cell.
So the very molecule that's used to acetylate proteins and regulate genes is also a product of our metabolism.
Exactly. It's all interconnected.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is, and that interconnectedness is what makes this whole process so fascinating.
So it's not just a one-way street.
No, it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Acetylation doesn't just influence metabolism, it's intricately intertwined with it.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've got these acetyl groups derived from acetyl-CoA, which is a key player in metabolism.
Yes.
And these acetyl groups attach to proteins and histones, influencing everything from gene expression to cellular energy production.
It's a beautiful system.
And you're saying this all ties into diseases like cancer as well.
Absolutely. We're just scratching the surface here.
This is a lot to take in.
It is, but you're doing great. You're starting to see just how far-reaching the impact of acetylation truly is.
Yeah, I think we're going to need to take a little break here and let our listeners absorb all this incredible information. We'll be right back with part 2 of our deep dive on acetylation.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Glad we're getting to dive a little deeper into this acetylation stuff.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me how, these tiny little chemical tweaks can have such a profound effect on our biology. It's like there's this whole other layer of control inside our cells that we're just now starting to understand.
You got it. And what's even more remarkable is that we're really just starting to scratch the surface. There's still so much we don't know about acetylation.
That's what makes it so exciting. It's like we're explorers charting this uncharted territory.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
So where do we go from here? What aspect of acetylation are we going to delve into next?
Well, you mentioned earlier that acetylation can influence protein function. I think that's a great place to start. We talked about how adding or removing acetyl groups can actually change a protein's shape and activity.
Right, like changing the configuration of gears in a complex machine.
Exactly. But what we didn't really get into is how this affects specific cellular processes. For example, did you know that acetylation plays a key role in cellular signaling pathways?
Wait, so we're talking about how cells talk to each other?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And this communication is essential for coordinating all sorts of cellular activities, from growth and development to immune responses.
Okay, so how does acetylation fit into all of this?
We'll think of a signaling pathway like a relay race.
Okay.
Each runner passes a baton to the next, and the message gets transmitted down the line.
Mm-hmm.
So in this analogy, proteins are the runners, and acetylation can either help or hinder their ability to pass the baton.
Oh, I see. So if a key protein in a signaling pathway is improperly acetylated, the message could get garbled or even lost.
Yeah, exactly. And this can have some serious consequences. For instance, let's take the WANT signaling pathway. It's a really crucial pathway that's involved in embryonic development, tissue regeneration, and even cancer.
The WENT pathway. I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex pathway, but the key takeaway here is that it relies on this very precise sequence of protein interactions. And research has shown that acetylation plays a really critical role in regulating those interactions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all ties together. So acetylation is kind of like a fine-tuning mechanism for these signaling pathways, making sure that the right messages are being transmitted at the right time.
Exactly. It's like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, making sure that each instrument plays its part in harmony.
But what happens if the conductor loses control?
Well, that's when things can start to go wrong. Dysregulation of acetylation and signaling pathways has been linked to a whole bunch of different diseases, including cancer, neurodegenerative disorders, and even metabolic diseases like diabetes.
Wow, so the implications are huge. So by understanding how acetylation affects these signaling pathways, could we potentially develop new therapies for these diseases?
That's the hope. And there are already some really promising avenues of research. For example, scientists are investigating molecules that can modulate acetylation levels, either by inhibiting the enzymes that remove acetyl groups or by boosting the activity of enzymes that add those groups.
So it's like having a toolkit for fine-tuning these cellular signaling pathways.
That's a great way to put it. It's still early days, but the potential is definitely there. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the connection between acetylation and metabolism.
Right. We left off last time with that really intriguing idea that acetyl-CoA, the molecule that donates acetyl groups, is also a key player in our metabolism. It sounded like there's this fascinating feedback loop going on there.
You're right on the money. It's not just that acetyl-CoA is involved in both acetylation and metabolism, it's that they are intricately interconnected.
Okay, can you elaborate on that a bit? What does this interconnectedness actually look like?
Sure. Imagine your body as this bustling city.
Okay, I'm listening.
There are power plants, generating energy factories, producing goods, and a really complex transportation system moving things around.
I like where this is going.
So in this analogy, acetyl-CoA is like the main energy currency of the city. It's produced from the breakdown of nutrients like carbs, fats, and proteins.
Okay, so it's the fuel that keeps the city running.
Exactly. And some of this acetyl-CoA goes to the power plants where it's used to generate ATP, the cell's primary energy source.
Uh-huh.
But another portion of this acetyl-CoA is diverted to other factories in the city.
And those other factories are where acetylation happens.
That's it. In those factories, acetyl-CoA is used to modify proteins, including those involved in gene expression signaling pathways and even the metabolic pathways themselves.
So it's like a portion of the city's energy currency is being invested in regulating and fine-tuning the city's operations.
Precisely. And this really highlights that interconnectedness I was talking about earlier. The availability of acetyl-CoA influences not only the cell's energy production, but also its ability to regulate itself through acetylation.
This is incredible. It's like the cell has this elegant system of checks and balances, making sure that energy production and these regulatory processes are all in sync.
Exactly. It's a beautiful example of how interconnected our biology really is. And this interconnectedness has profound implications for our health, especially when it comes to metabolic disorders like obesity and diabetes.
Oh, that sounds like a perfect segue into part 3. We'll be back soon to explore those fascinating links between acetylation, obesity, and diabetes. Stay tuned because things are about to get really interesting. All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into acetylation. It's amazing how much this tiny chemical modification can affect practically everything that goes on inside of our cells.
It is really quite remarkable, and the more we learn about acetylation, the more we realize just how significant it is, especially when it comes to complex health issues like obesity and diabetes.
Right. In part 2, we were talking about how acetyl-CoA, the molecule that provides those acetyl groups, is really deeply connected to metabolism. It's like an energy currency and a regulatory tool all rolled into one. But I'm still a little fuzzy on how this all connects to obesity and diabetes.
Sure. Well, both of these conditions are fundamentally rooted in energy imbalances. Right, with obesity, you've got an excess of energy intake compared to expenditure, and that leads to weight gain. And with diabetes, the body's ability to regulate blood sugar is disrupted, often due to problems with insulin signaling.
Okay, so we've got these energy regulation problems, but how does acetylation fit into the picture? Does it make these imbalances worse, or can it actually help?
Well, the answer, as with many things in biology, is complicated. Let's start with obesity. Studies have shown that acetylation can actually influence appetite and satiety signals in the brain, which basically means it plays a role in how hungry or full we feel.
So if I'm constantly craving that extra slice of pizza, could that be due to acetylation gone haywire in my brain?
It's not quite that simple, but you're on the right track. Acetylation can definitely impact those neural pathways that govern our eating behavior, although it's certainly not the only factor involved.
Okay, so it's not just about willpower. There's this complex interplay of chemical signals at play. But could manipulating acetylation actually help manage obesity? Maybe by tweaking those appetite signals?
That's a question that researchers are actively exploring. But remember, it's not just about appetite. Acetylation also affects energy expenditure. You know how our bodies burn calories?
Interesting. How so?
Well, remember how acetylation can regulate those metabolic enzymes. It can influence the activity of enzymes involved in processes like fatty acid oxidation, which is the breakdown of fats for energy.
So if we could boost the acetylation of those fat-burning enzymes, could we potentially ramp up our metabolism and burn more calories?
That's the idea. And some animal studies have actually shown some promise. But as always, it's a delicate balance. We need to be cautious because manipulating acetylation could have unintended consequences on other cellular processes.
Of course, messing with such a fundamental process is not something to be taken lightly. So we've talked about obesity, but what about diabetes? How does acetylation affect the body's response to insulin?
That's another area of active research, and it's equally complex. Insulin resistance, a hallmark of type 2 diabetes, means the body cells aren't responding properly to insulin. the hormone that helps regulate blood sugar. And it seems that acetylation is involved in those insulin signaling pathways.
So could acetylation actually help improve insulin sensitivity? Could it make our cells more responsive to insulin?
Some studies suggest that it can. Increased acetylation of certain proteins involved in insulin signaling seems to enhance insulin sensitivity.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. Other studies show that excessive acetylation can actually worsen insulin resistance.
Wow, so it's a double-edged sword. It seems like finding the right balance is absolutely crucial. Too much or too little acetylation can throw things way off.
Precisely. It really highlights the complexity of these systems. More research is definitely needed to fully understand the nuances of acetylation's role in diabetes and to develop targeted therapies that can strike the right balance.
It's mind-boggling to think about how much we've learned about acetylation, and yet we're really just scratching the surface. It's exciting and humbling at the same time.
I agree. It reminds us that even the smallest molecular tweaks can have these profound effects on our health. And the more we understand these intricate processes, the better equipped we'll be to develop effective treatments for these complex diseases.
Well, this deep dive into acetylation has definitely been enlightening. I think I'm walking away with a whole new appreciation for the complexity of our own biology and the incredible potential of scientific research.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a truly fascinating field with so much more to uncover. Who knows what amazing discoveries are waiting for us in the future?
That's what makes science so thrilling. A huge thank you to all of you, our listeners, for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of acetylation. We hope you found it as fascinating as we did.
And remember, the quest for knowledge never really ends. So keep asking questions, stay curious, and who knows, maybe you'll be the one to make the next big breakthrough in understanding this remarkable process.
Until next time, keep exploring.